Okay, we are on. So, hi everyone and welcome. Today we are excited to have Jeremy S. Adams with us. Jeremy is an amazing author and educator who writes about the challenges facing America's young people and our values as a society. He has written books like Hollowed Out, a warning about America's next generation, Riding the Wave, The Secrets of Timeless Teachers, Full Classrooms Empty Selves, and Lessons in Liberty. Jeremy, thank you for being with us here today, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts and learning from you. And maybe you could start with telling us a little about yourself and your background as a teacher.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jeremy Adams. I've been a teacher at the same high school for 27 years. It's the only high school where I've ever taught. It's probably the only place where I will ever teach. This is a school that in Bakersfield, California, that's kind of special because it looks like the rest of the country, right? It's a real microcosm. It's really kind of a representative of the whole nation. We have everything there. We have, white, black, Hispanic, Asian. We have poor kids and rich kids and all religious backgrounds. And so this is the school where I've taught for 27 years. It's where I went to high school. It's where my children went to high school. And one of the reasons why I think I'm talking to you today is because about 12 or 13 years ago, I decided to do something that made my life difficult. I decided to start a second career as a writer. And anybody who ever listens to this podcast, I just want you to know right now, if you ever want to have high self-esteem, don't try to be a writer because there is so much rejection and so much failure. But one of the magical things I discovered in my writer journey was that when I started writing about my classroom, when I started writing about what I was seeing, what I realized was there was a huge audience for it for one reason, Harry, and that is because most Americans are about 2 or 3 years behind in understanding what's happening in our classrooms. And so teachers, we're never going to be rich, we're never going to be famous, but we teachers do have one superpower, and that superpower is we see things before anybody else does, right? So we stand at this really interesting intersection of technology and culture and politics and parenting. And so when we see something changing in our classroom, it's kind of like looking into the future a little bit because these are young people and all of a sudden things change. And so I realized, Harry, that was really fertile ground to write about. So, I realized that if I want to have an audience, I should be writing about what I'm seeing in the classroom and what I'm hearing from my colleagues throughout the country. So I just want to be very clear. I'm a teacher who writes, not a writer who happens to teach.
I understand. Before we get into the meat of the subject, I would like for you to explain to my audience what is the purpose of education.
I think the purpose of education is so that human beings can fulfill their promise of their nature. I think that, if you ask 10 teachers, what's the purpose of education, you would get 10 different answers. I think it depends on the subject they teach. But to me, if you are a citizen in a democratic society, you realize that without education, you cannot have your political system. You cannot have a free market economy. You cannot have science. You cannot have art. And most of all, to me, education is, yes, it is about the community and the country. Aristotle said that the purpose of education was to renew the values upon which your society is built. But there's also an individual purpose of education, and that is for you to digest intellectually and morally the best that has ever been written and the best that has ever been thought. I'm a big believer in asking the big questions, the questions that every human being must face that reside in the inner sanctum of their humanity. It's what Dostoevsky called the eternal questions. So I think education is about facing these questions and rallying all the possible answers and trying to figure out what this thing called life is all about.
Mhm. I agree. In one of your presentations in the YouTube, you spoke about different signs that you started to see about 10 years ago that
Yeah.
led you to write the book Hollowed Out, which is your opus magnum, right? So if you can tell us a little about those signs, what worried you? What did you see?
Yeah, that's a great description. So you're right, about 8 or 9 years ago, and I just want to be very clear. A lot of people think that COVID ruined education. COVID hurt education, but let me be very clear to your audience. A lot of the problems that are in our educational system started way before COVID, right? And COVID amplified and accelerated these problems, but they didn't create them. So this is the thing about teaching for as long as I have, which is that when things change, you notice. You're like, well, that's different. I haven't heard that before. I haven't seen that before. And it was a bunch, Harry. It was a bunch of little things I was noticing. Things like the students all of a sudden didn't really know much about their own country. They didn't know much about their leaders. They didn't know much about current events. And then you start talking to them about, how they spend their time, little things. And I noticed things like, nobody has meals with their families anymore. I used the phrase the family meal or the family dinner, and nobody knew what I was talking about. I used the word pulpit to describe something, and they had no idea what a pulpit was. You reference anything in religion, they didn't know much about religion. I started to notice they weren't going to football games, they weren't going to basketball games. Many of them started to talk very negatively about America and its history, and it seemed to be all negative all the time. When they talked about their futures, they really didn't have any interest in. A lot of them didn't have any interest in marriage. Definitely didn't have any interest in having families. Very, very cynical view of the future because of climate change and environmentalism, and so they also had become very, very lonely. A lot of kids weren't spending time with other kids, and so all of these things that were kind of the foundation of my life growing up. My family, my faith, my community, my country. Reading, art. They don't read books. They don't go to the movies anymore. And of course, Harry. I mean, this has been said so much; it's just kind of banal and boring at this point. But I think everybody knows they have an absolutely fanatical, monomaniacal obsession with their phones. They live on their screens. They stare at the dang screen up to 9 or 10 hours a day. They don't spend a lot of time around adults. I mean, to me, that's the real problem with the phones, is that the phones have displaced reading. They have displaced friendship. They have displaced going out with friends. And so I was noticing a bunch of little things, but what it all added up to, Harry, was that they were unhappy. I mean, when the book came out, when Hollowed Out came out 2 or 3 years ago, the criticism I got was, oh, well, you're just grumpy. You're just being cranky. Every generation thinks the next generation's going to hell, and you're just a grumpy old man. Now, first of all, I'm not old. Okay. Second of all, I'm not grumpy. And most importantly, the things I was seeing were unique. They were different. And one of the cool things about my writing career is that I'll notice something in my classroom, and then I'll ask other teachers, in my school or across the country, are you seeing this too? And then I'll do research on it, and then all of a sudden you find out that these things are changing. They are different, and so they all added up to one big thing, Harry. And this is the most important point I'm going to make on this podcast. Our young people are unhappy. They are the most unhappy generation of Americans. And I know you're in Israel, but in America, this is the most unhappy generation of Americans in the history of our nation. Some of the statistics are so bad. You have to look, you read them, and you have to read them twice. Things like half of American teenagers do not value their own lives. Half of American teenagers say they do not enjoy their lives. Here's a statistic that is so unbelievable. About 4 or 5 years ago, the CDC released a statistic where 1 out of 4 18 to 24-year-olds. Okay, these are young people, 18 to 24-year-old. Man, I wish I could be that age sometimes. 1 out of 4 have actually contemplated suicide. So I don't want to hear that I'm being alarmist. I don't want to hear that I'm being cranky. I don't want to hear that this is the same in every generation, because it's not.
So you're basically talking about a generation of children who are living in isolation, disconnected from their network of adults and family and community and sense of purpose, and basically they are being atomized. So would you say that what is how would you describe their mental status right now, the people, the children? Do they have like a positive outlook on society and life, or do they like have some kind of nihilistic way of life and despair? And I think you mentioned in one of your amazing articles, you spoke about the despair they feel without any sense of purpose, without any meaning, just despair for nothingness. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that article. I was very proud of it. One of the things that you see are the mental health crisis. Our young people are so deeply unhappy. And there are a million statistics, in addition to the ones I just named, that you can find. I mean, you can look at, there was an article in the New York Times, I think a year ago, where you had this weird phenomenon where you have ER doctors seeing this surge of young people coming into the ER because they're so anxious and unhappy, or you see rates of suicide and attempted suicide, eating disorders. The word that I hear all the time, Harry, is anxiety. Our young people are on edge all the time. They can't enjoy their lives. They can't, take a moment and relax. And you referenced it. The article that I wrote is about this, making this argument that young Americans are uniquely miserable. And by that, I mean, not that other societies don't have other miserable, situations. They do. And suffering and pain are inherent in the human condition, right? We all suffer. And here's a little secret that we don't like to talk about. And that is we're all broken, all of us. Every moment we're suffering in one way or another. Our bodies are imperfect. We're insecure. We're worried about our families and money, and we always feel like we're not good enough. And yet, for most of human history, when people suffer, they suffer in service of something bigger than themselves. And that's the point of the article, is that oftentimes people who are religious suffer because of guilt, because they feel like they're not serving God. People who are in the trenches, who are serving in the military, or who have to be, in a submarine, they're suffering. It's unpleasant, but they're doing it in service of their nation, right? A newborn child makes their parents suffer because they're not sleeping, but we love the child. So that suffering is in service of love. Right now, I'll tell everybody, I'm suffering. You know why? Because I have 2 daughters in college. I'm poor, right? I'm paying a lot of money right now for their education. I'm suffering. I'm worried about money all the time. But you know what? It's because I love them and I believe in the power and the poignancy of their education. And so we always are suffering, but we're suffering in service of something great. This is in all the great literature. You see the suffering in the Odyssey of Odysseus not being able to be home. You see suffering in the Iliad with Achilles not getting the recognition that he requires, right? And yet today, a lot of our young people are suffering, but they're not suffering in service of a larger ideal, right? They're not suffering because they're connected to something that they believe in. They're suffering in isolation because, and again, it's really hard to make, too big of generalizations. I mean, let me be very clear. I teach a lot of young people who are amazing, who are happy and optimistic and hardworking, and they believe in love and friendship, and they read. And so, I mean, there are a lot of great young people, right? So, I mean, what I'm talking about is kind of the general trends that you see. But by and large, you do see a generation that is not connected to things bigger than themselves. And this is one of the reasons why I love to teach, is that really teaching, I mean, you asked me earlier, what's the purpose of education? Teaching is really about exposing our young people to the possibilities of their own lives, and to realize, C.S. Lewis said that we read to know that we are not alone. I mean, very few of us ever encounter any unique problems in our lives. We very rarely encounter things that other human beings haven't encountered a million times. And the problem is, what we know is that we find meaning and purpose in our lives by using our freedom to connect to things that we find to be important: causes, relationships, places, ideas, right? And yet young people are very isolated. They are cocooned in a kind of nihilistic place of, and this is what the phones do. I mean, let me put it this way, and this is how I described it in my book, Hollowed Out. We usually find meaning by looking up, don't we? By looking up into something greater than ourselves. You know, we look up to Mount Rushmore. We look up into the heavens. We look up into people who know more than we do. And we say, I want to be like that person. What do our young people do? Here's a phone right here. You know what they're
The
doing?
phone,
Yeah,
looking down the phone.
they're looking down, or they're looking in a mirror. Nobody ever found inspiration and contentment by looking down or by just looking at themselves all the time. Narcissus was not a happy soul. And that's what I see today.
Mhm. What do you think led to that? Do you think it's even designed that we reach this point of isolation, despair, lack of meaning? And what is it that the children of today, the new generation, are finding in this absolute lack of, there is no role model, there is nothing to imitate, there is nothing to
Yeah.
aspire to be, how do you say, to aspire to,
Yeah.
and eventually we are just looking at our phone. And can you speak to
Yeah.
that, please?
Well, again, first of all, let me just say, there are, there are some very, very big thinkers and writers and philosophers in Western civilization today who are tackling, this problem of ennui or despair, or what I call being hollowed out. And there are people who, are very famous who are tackling these problems. People like Charles Taylor, or people who, dealing with, kind of a lot of the post liberals. A lot of people are tackling this problem of modern despair and disconnection. But I'm only a high school teacher, but I will tell you, I do think that it's two things. I think number one, I do think that even before the cell phones, and this is my big theory, I think before the cell phones, there was a kind of radical individualism that really had developed in our culture, where we began to celebrate people who were the iconoclasts, who didn't go along with the majority, who really did want to stick out and kind of give the middle finger to kind of the main currents of our culture. And I think individualism is good, but I think what's happened is that young people began to misunderstand individualism. They began to misunderstand individual freedom. Individual freedom is powerful and great when you use your freedom to connect to things that you think are meaningful. For most of human society, most of human civilization, society was structured where you didn't get to choose what to connect yourself to. What status of society you were born into dictated what you did with your life. Were you an aristocrat? Were you a vassal? Were you a lord? Were you a man? Were you a woman? But you were a subject of a king. You were a member of a church. You had a job that was given to you. When you were a young person, you knew what your life was going to look like. And the beauty of classical liberalism, the beauty of our society today, is that everybody gets to choose for themselves what they're loyal to, what they believe in, what they want to connect to. And we are not subjects of anything other than ourselves. The government is there to serve us, not the other way around. But what's happened, Harry, in the last, I think, 10, 15, 20 years, is that young people have used the freedom, instead of to connect to something bigger than themselves, they've used their freedom to connect to nothing. And that, I think, is what's led to a lot of unhappiness. Is, we think that, a lot of young people, they will look, and if somebody looked at me 15 years ago, I had two, young daughters. I had two jobs where I was teaching at high school and I was teaching at night. And my wife is an attorney and she was working. And I looked tired and I looked run down. And I'm sure my students looked at me and said, man, look at Mr. Adams. He's tired and run down. Why would we get married? Why would we have kids? Why would we why would we work all the time? And yet what I think they misunderstood is that the ties that bind us are also the ties that define us, right? So yes, it's hard to be a parent. It's hard to be a teacher. It's hard to be a Christian. It's hard to be a good citizen. And yet those difficult connections give my life real substance, right? Real meaning. And I think that a lot of young people began to believe that the easiest life is a life where you don't connect to anything. And that's where you see things like, nobody wants to join a church. Civic associations are in decline. You really see people who look at marriage and they say, well, if I get married, that's just kind of maybe that's a different way of finding happiness, instead of saying, no, I'm going to commit myself to a person I love more than I love myself. And that will transform me morally and spiritually for the better. Not about making me happy, but actually serving somebody else will really refine my soul and transform me. And so I think that this kind of radical individualism has infected and ensnared the souls of our young people. And then, this is my big part of the theory here, that was the fire. That was the fire that we already had. And then what did the phones do? The phones put the gas onto the fire, right? It's a lighter fluid. And the phones really rewarded isolation. They really rewarded individualism. And so that, it's kind of radicalized individualism, where now I'm taking selfies. I'm looking at my own content. I want people to like me. I need all those dopamine hits that the internet gives me. And so really it allowed, kids to be isolated now. They didn't have to leave the house to talk to people. They didn't have to leave the house, to connect. And of course, what's happened is, and we can talk about this later, Harry, but what's happened is these phones have completely, and Silicon Valley knows what it's doing. That's why, all the Silicon Valley titans, they don't let their kids on these platforms. They don't let them with these technologies. It has rewired our brains. It's made it so our students can't read, they can't pay attention. They don't have the neural capacity to focus for long periods of time. They want to stare at their phones in the middle of class. And the phones have just displaced all the important stuff in their life, books and relationships and going out and whatever. And I think in a lot of ways, it's also radicalized them. I think a lot of them see content that is always negative. Social media is not really good at things like gratitude and optimism. It's really good at negativity and cynicism and celebrating a cult of victimhood. It's really good at that. And that again, you believe the things that you look at for hours a day. And so I think the culture changed. And then I think that the phones doubled down on that culture and made it even worse and isolated our kids.
I see. My next question, I'm asking with respect, of course, but if you take, for example, John Taylor Gatto, he speaks about the education system as something that was meant and designed to create obedient, conformist children who are part of like a beehive of a collective, not free individuals like you would expect to see as the result of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, and someone who is looking for the moral excellence. How do you say it? Like excellency?
Yeah. Moral excellence. Yeah.
Yeah, to be an individual moral agent and all those good things. So maybe all that you see is the end result, the final product of the educational system as was produced and designed by the Prussians and later on arrived to the States. Do you see a connection?
Yeah, no, I reject that. I don't think that for a second. And the reason I don't believe that is because our education system didn't particularly change. What the classroom looks like, what the curriculum is, what the pedagogy is, what the funding mechanisms are. At least in American education, these changes that I really started to see, 8, 9, 10, 11 years ago, it didn't happen in the midst of rapid or profound educational change. The classroom and the school where I taught for the first 15 years of my career looked like and sounded like and acted like the school that I went to in the 1990s and the school that my older siblings went to in the 1980s. And if that had been the case, if what you're saying was the reason for it, I think it would have happened much, much earlier. Now, I do believe that in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been changes in American education that are not good. I wouldn't blame the Prussians. I wouldn't blame, John Dewey. But I do believe that a lot of the trends in education in the last 4 or 5 years can really, really be pinpointed as I wouldn't blame them for the hollowing out of our kids, but they definitely haven't helped. And so let me just kind of talk about that a little bit. We live in this era now. I just had a piece in the New York Post last week that talked about how, a lot of teachers nowadays, they're not seen as being agents of high expectations. That when we look at teaching nowadays, and I'm traditional. I'm sorry. I believe that there's never been a better way of educating kids than direct instruction. Having a teacher at the front of the room who is highly engaged, who is delivering high quality instruction that has discussion with the kids, eye contact with the kids, a relationship with the kids, who has things like note taking and discussion and frequent examinations and expectations of behavior that are consistent and explicit, so that the kids know what's going on, and making sure that it's the same day after day. And so to me, a lot of the things that we see in education nowadays, where a lot of it is group work, a lot of it is kind of activities, a lot of it is online learning. The phones, of course, are a problem. A lot of teachers allow their kids to be on their phones the whole period, so they're watching videos, they're gaming, they're listening to music. And I would also say that a lot of people think that high expectations are bad because some kids don't reach them. Whereas I would tell you that high expectations are a gift, they are a blessing. And as long as you have teachers who believe in supporting those high expectations, that's where the magic of education is found. I don't believe that we are producing, automatons and, these radically monolithic citizens. I've taught thousands and thousands of students, and they are very diverse in what they do with their education. And so that's where I stand on that. We can talk about all kinds of the problems that we have nowadays with discipline policies and technology and a lot of the social emotional emphasis. But I definitely wouldn't blame education for the hollowing out of our kids completely. It's there. It's just a component.
Actually, maybe you can speak a little about the SEL and the social emotional learning and the influence of the DEI and all this neo-Marxist initiative in school. How does it affect the identity of the child? How does he connect himself now with some kind of a group identity? And eventually, do you even recognize how they are turning them into political vehicles eventually? Do you
Yeah.
see any of that?
I'll be honest. I think a lot of that is, at the college level, you see a lot of it. The University of Michigan is dealing with that now, and that's definitely a college phenomenon. I honestly, for high school kids, I just want my kids to show up every day, Harry. I don't know any teachers who are, making their kids read Das Kapital or Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think,
Yes.
again, and I consider myself to be conservative, but I do think sometimes the right wing kind of thinks that, it's a bunch of Marxist indoctrination happening. That maybe there are some classrooms somewhere where that's happening. My kids can't, a lot of my students can't read very well. A lot of my students don't show up to school 5 days a week. A lot of my students, a lot of the students in high school where I teach, come from a home where nobody ever talks about college, where reading levels are low. So, again, that's there. And I know that it gets a lot of headlines and it gets a lot of clicks and all of that. But for me, that's not the main problem that I see in the classroom. I see a problem of values and as far as individual values and behavior. But I don't, the DEI thing, I know that's there. I know that it's a problem, especially in colleges, but it's not so much in my world. I will say that. There are people who believe that, for instance, like in a social studies class, the first thing we should do is engage in an exploration of all of our identities, our racial identity, our gender identity, our whatever identity. To me, that's really not my place. I want my kids to know the branches of government. I want them to know the difference between a continent and a country. And so, yeah, there are people out there who I would say maybe are kind of activists, but by and large, the problem that 90% of teachers have is behavior and values and the lack of ability to do basic educational tasks that are asked of them.
So basically, we can pinpoint the problem to a problem of culture, a problem of
Yes.
family. It begins with the family then. It begins with the community.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and go ahead and ask your question. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, you're not talking too much. It's a delight to hear you. Do you think that it's connected to the breakup of the family, single home parenthood, wedlock? How do you say it? Like
Out of wedlock
out of
birth.
wedlock,
Yeah.
pregnancy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is the thing, Harry, that nobody wants to talk about, right? And this is, I started teaching in 1998, and there was this movement that essentially said, look, if we could just fix if we could just get teachers to do a better job, and if we could just get schools to do a better job, then the kids, it wouldn't matter what happened before the kid arrived at school. Right? What happens in their home life or their neighborhoods or their community or the culture doesn't matter. But if we can magically transform schools, then we can transform the children and transform society. And there was this real movement. I mean, this is what No Child Left Behind was that, we were going to have highly credentialed instruction, and we were going to have high standards. And again, I'm all for having good teachers, and I'm all for having good credentials. That's fine. That's great. But what we don't want to admit, what we don't want to say is that 90% of the success of a student has nothing to do with the teacher or the school, right? I mean, and again, there's a lot of research to suggest that most of the things that go into being a successful student, like literacy, like behavior, like, do I want to go get an advanced degree? All of these things are happening before the students enter my classroom. So again, I'm going to give you a statistic. 91% of the time that a 5 to 18-year-old spends in their life, right, between the ages of 5 and 18, 91% of the time they spend is not at school. It's not at school. It's on their phones. It's in their communities. It's at home. It's with friends that they have. And it is absolutely ridiculous to assume that schools are going to be a kind of this utopian factory of ideals that I don't think are ever going to be achieved unless we talk about culture and family first. And again, and I know that, let me tell you why people don't like to say that. People don't like to say that because politicians can't do anything about it, right? Politicians can spend money, they can design programs, but it's really hard to get politicians to design programs where parents read to their children or save for college or help them with their homework or monitor what they're looking at their phones. I teach a kind of the honors level classes, and I'm very lucky. And the reason why I'm so lucky is my students walk in the first day and they want to be there. Maybe they don't care about the subject, but they want to go to college. They want to graduate from high school. They know how to be respectful. They know how to sit in a classroom. They know how to take notes. All of that stuff, Harry, happened before they came into my classroom. So again, I think it's this kind of magical solution illusion that we engage in when we keep thinking that, if we can just fix the schools, that everything's going to be okay. No. You have to fix the culture, and you have to fix the way they spend their time outside of the classroom. Now, that's not an excuse for being bad teachers. That's not an excuse for bad policy. That's not an excuse for, as you said, using the classroom to try and indoctrinate, which, happens, I think, sometimes much more in college than in high school. But most of the problems are happening outside of the classroom. And again, I teach economics as well. And one of the things I like to say is that inputs matter, right? You cannot have really low quality inputs and have a high quality output. You ask any restaurant, what is the key to your success? And they will say, we get top quality chefs and top quality food, right? That's being prepared. And so inputs matter. And we don't like to say that, but you're right. It's true.
So if the responsibility belongs to us, the parents, the community, then how do we go about to help people find sense of purpose, and what kind of role models should we point out to? How do we rebuild back the culture? How do we bring back traditions? How do we convince the children that history and all those giants that we can learn from matter? How do we do that?
That's really well said. That's a beautiful question. That's a wonderful question. Let me answer it this way, and let me be blunt for your audience. Mm-hmm. There is no easy solution, right? It is much easier to destroy habits and institutions than it is to build them or to rebuild them. And one of the things we see right now in our culture is a real abandonment of institutions. People like to destroy institutions and complain about institutions. I'm not much of a populist, to be perfectly honest with you, because populism is really about bringing down institutions or talking about how corrupt the institutions are. And I'm not saying that our institutions are perfect, but it's much better to rebuild them than to just endlessly trying to destroy them. And so there is no solution to this. And let me tell you what the solution is. The solution is quite simple. Our young people suffer from a real lack of meaningful presence and connection to adults, right? And this is, you asked 20 minutes ago what caused all this. And I should have said in the answer, young people are growing up today really distant from adults. And, if you think about it 100 years ago, young people lived in a house with, mom and dad. Sometimes they had 4 grandparents living with them. Sometimes they had, lots of older brothers and sisters. When they went to school, the teacher was in charge, right? The students didn't feel like they were in charge and could be disrespectful. You knew what you had to do in a classroom. Otherwise, there were severe consequences. On Saturday or Sunday, you went to church and you were around more adults teaching you about the great traditions of your religion. When you watched the news, you saw adults talking about current events. When you read books, it was adults from the past encountering the big questions of human existence. Young people learn by example, right? That's how human beings learn. And we are either improved by the examples in front of us, or we are depraved by the examples that are not there. And young people, think about how a lot of young people grow up today. They grow up, many of them, with one adult in their household. That adult is oftentimes gone because they're working multiple jobs. They go to school, and a lot of schooling nowadays is, working on computers, working on Chromebooks, doing activities. They don't read, a lot of classical books. They're not asked to do a lot of difficult things. There is no real, church for most of them on Sunday or Saturday. You don't have reading, right? So young people don't read particularly. Only 16% of teenagers nowadays spend more than 10 minutes a day reading. Again, if you look at it, you are more likely, talk about a disturbing statistic, Harry, you are more likely to be reading a novel at 13 years old in this country than you are at 17. Teenagers give up on reading. Why? Because the phones destroy the reading. Just the time that it takes and the patience that it takes, they just don't do it. So, you ask, how do we fix it? We adults have got to continue. The adults have to adult. We have to tether ourselves to adult values, adult expectations, adult behaviors. And young people need to see it. We need to be around them more. A lot of young people are isolated. They spend so many hours a day by themselves. And when they are by themselves, they're looking at content on their phones created by other teenagers. That doesn't help anybody.
I understand. Maybe you can give us a list of productive, practical things that we as parents can actually do to save our children from this despair and isolation. Like, what can we do at home, at our community, to fix it right now? Not in 10 years, not through the politicians, not through anyone, just by real action right now.
Yeah, great question. And let me kind of bore you a little bit with a famous study. There was a study about 10, 15 years ago where, and I don't remember who did the study, but the hypothesis was that if you are a parent and you volunteer at the school, right? If you're on the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, or, maybe you go into the classroom a lot. The hypothesis was that parents who are really involved in the school are going to have students who do better, right? Their academic outcomes will be better. And the conclusion, what they found was something really interesting. And what they found was you actually don't need to do that much. The most important predictor of a student's success is, do you have at least one meaningful conversation a day with your child? One. And it doesn't have to be about politics or religion. It doesn't have to be about school. It can be about sports. You can be gossiping with your kid about stuff that happened in PE that day, but you have to be able to, if you have one meaningful conversation a day with your child, that is the best predictor. And this is why, in Hollowed Out, I cited a study from Harvard where they said, parents who eat meals with their kids, who actually, make the meal, they sit down, they eat, and they talk, that is correlated to so many positive things. Like, those kids are less likely to do drugs. They're less likely to get pregnant. They're more likely to get better grades. They're more likely to have good friendships. And so, we just have to be in the lives of our children more. Here's something that's going to break your heart, and that a lot of people, if you're not in the classroom, you might not hear. But there's I want to tell you about a conversation I had with a student recently. And this student, sometimes the student is in my first period class. So this person is there before school sometimes. And this person kind of listens to sometimes when my wife is having a difficult morning with my son, and she's like, "Oh, our son's being so difficult," or this went wrong, or you have to go do this after school. This student kind of hears kind of the conversations I'm talking to. But she said something really beautiful to me. She said, I admire the fact that, you care enough to be frustrated, because a lot of parents don't really ask about their children, don't ask about their lives, don't ask what's going on. And it's very much like a lot of conversations I've had the last decade where, if a student of mine is doing poorly or they're not showing up to school, I'll kind of take them aside and say, what's going on? Like, why aren't you here? You need to be here every day. You need to study. And, at first a teenager's like, oh, I don't like that. I don't like somebody confronting me. But most of the time, deep inside, they actually like it because it means they know that I care about them. And I have had so many students come to me at the end of the school year and say, Mr. Adams, thank you for getting on me about not studying. Thank you for, kind of asking where I am. There's nobody in my life that gives a damn about where I am and what I'm doing. I don't have any adults who really care about me. And the fact that you care meant a lot to me. So I think it would be shocking if people understood just how little adult modeling and mentorship there is in our society. And to me, that is the number one thing we have to do is the adults, stop being a friend of your children. Stop being a friend of your students. They have enough friends. Stop trying to be cool, right? You need to show authority and wisdom, guidance, and love. That's what you need to show young people. They have enough friends. They have enough equals. They don't need any more of that.
I 100% agree with you. You spoke about the vegetative educational system, and I think that it's even more like that since COVID.
Yes.
Can you explain about what you mean by that and like
Yeah. No.
demonstrate it?
So, when COVID happened, the word that we teachers in America heard all the time was grace. Be graceful. Don't grade hard. A lot of the kids don't have Wi-Fi connections. They don't have computers. Don't fail them. And by the way, early on, I agree. That's absolutely the case. I think being really hard on the kids. March of 2020, we all went on quarantine, and I think being hardcore. For the next few weeks, when a lot of them didn't even know what was going on. I understand that. But what happened was the next year, when everybody stayed home and we were doing distance learning, and in some states like California, where I am, we were away for over a year. And I mean, the statistics about what's happened since COVID, were grades. I mean, all you need to know is this. All you need to know is that grades in America are higher than they've ever been, and test scores are dropping. Right. So what does that tell you? That tells you that class is not very hard. And that's what we mean by vegetative education. Vegetative education is a lot of group work. It's a lot of, posters. It's a lot of free time. It's a lot of online activities. It's a lot of don't worry about deadlines. It doesn't include tests. It doesn't include papers. It includes a lot of very, broad ideas like, well, we need to encourage critical thinking, and we need to encourage cooperation. I mean, I agree. Of course we do. But nothing at the end of the day, education has got to be about knowledge and skills, right? And kids can't educate themselves. And I think this vegetative education, it's really apparent to me, and this is what my New York Post article that kind of blew up was all about, is, students will ask me questions that just blow my mind. And not just me. I mean, I hear this from other, because again, I have really great students, and not so much me sometimes, but the things I hear from my colleagues is students will say things like, "Are we doing anything today?" They will say things like, "We're taking a test. Can I just use my notes? Is that okay? I don't have to study, do I?" Students will come up and say, "I know there's a test today. I'm not taking it. I'm not ready. I don't want to do it. You need to let me do it tomorrow." Right? So, I mean, things that are just mind-boggling. And they really reveal that young people, they don't expect to be pushed very hard. And the test scores show that. We get out of things what we put into them. Everybody knows that. And if we don't ask our students to study, to do homework, to pay attention in class, if we use class time for, trying to make sure, and again, I have no problem with the basic idea of social emotional education. The basic idea is that kids should feel comfortable in your classroom. That's fine, but that should be the beginning, not the end. That's not the purpose of education, is to make you feel good about yourself.
Mhm.
Students should feel respected. They should feel safe. They should feel secure in your classroom so that you can teach them. That's not the purpose of education. And a lot of people have confused the means with the ends, the tactics with the strategy. That's a tactic. That's not a strategy. And so that's really what I mean by vegetative education. Everything is watered down. It's not very hard. And I think that's why, Harry, you see this, I don't know if you're familiar with kind of the classical school movement, where, classical education, the Greek term of paideia, of kind of, exposing young people to the classical books and to the most, traditional ideas and ways of learning, that is just taking off in the United States of America, because I think parents are seeing in a lot of our public schools that their kids aren't getting much out of it. There's not a lot of learning sometimes taking place because of, what we call vegetative education.
But who from the people who are responsible for the public education, why do they allow this to happen? Why did they allow it to become a vegetative state and not demanding of the children much more, and insisting on classical teaching,
Yeah.
like
Well,
the trivium or whatever, things that can actually help them?
Yeah, well, and the trivium. I mean, we're so far away from teaching rhetoric and all the
Grammar.
classical subjects, which I'm a big believer that the loss of oratory and rhetoric is kind of goes hand in hand with the decline in our civic culture. But that's a different topic. You ask why? I mean, I do think a lot of it was COVID, and what happens is, I think if you tell the kids, if you take them out of school and you tell them, you know what, you don't have to work very hard. You don't have to do very much. You can stay in your pajamas all day. You don't really have to turn on your camera. I mean, it was surreal teaching for a year of COVID, because, the kids would log in every day. They'd come into the Zoom, but they wouldn't turn on their cameras. They wouldn't turn on their microphones. It was just, I'm looking at you right now. You're in Israel. You're, 10 time zones ahead of me, man. And we're having this great conversation, but this is not what class was like. It was, I had 30 people logging in, and they muted their computers, and they didn't turn on their cameras, and I had no idea what was going on. And if you talk to them now, they will tell you, we were in bed, we were watching Netflix, we were on their phones, we were sleeping, we weren't doing much. And I think that habit of not having to do much and still getting a good grade, that stuck with these young people. And I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's a profound absenteeism crisis in America, where young people just are not coming to school, where, even I teach great students, even my kids, a lot of them would not come to school 5 days a week. They just couldn't do it. At least one day a week, they had to take a day off, or, I slept in, and those habits, I think, were changed with COVID. And I also think that the other thing that caused this, besides COVID, is this idea that, kind of traditional old-fashioned education isn't needed in a modern economy. I think we've commercialized education, and we see education in schools as just kind of on-the-job training. And so a lot of the subjects that are seen, why does somebody who cuts hair, why do they need to read Shakespeare? Right? Why does somebody who's going to be a petroleum engineer need to read the Federalist Papers? Right? So this idea that everybody should get a quality education, because education is more than just about your job, that idea has been lost. And to me, I mean, I think that, I want my heart surgeon to have read Plato, right? I want my pilot to know what Euclid wrote in the Elements. I want well-rounded human beings, because I think being well-rounded, embodying that Renaissance spirit, that classical education, I think that's the key to a meaningful life. And I want, no matter what your job is, I don't care if you're playing for the Yankees or you're, somebody who collects my trash every day. I think you're going to live a better life when you have a well-rounded education, where you've been exposed to the great ideas and the great books, and you can study and you can read and you can have all these capacities. And somewhere along the way, we really commercialized education and thought that it's just about getting a job someday. And I think that's really hurt us for for the worst.
I understand. Um, I remember that you said in one of your lectures or interviews, you mentioned that even after COVID, children are still coming with mask on their face, and
Yeah,
that's because they said they don't want to engage.
yeah,
Okay, so
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
yes, what did you want to say?
No, I was going to say this is one of those things that you only know if you talk to the students. You know, what I mean, if you talk to the students, some of them would be like, I remember them saying, "Well, they're not worried about getting COVID. They're not sick." Some of the kids will put on a mask in like one period. They're putting on math. In math, they'll put the mask on because it's a sign, like, leave me alone, like back off. I don't want to engage you. But then they'll take them off in their elective class when they, want to talk to the teacher and engage. And so, yeah, that's one of those things that, I wouldn't have known had I not talked to the other students.
Yeah. I would like to take the opportunity that you are here and you have a first row presence before the children. And I think it's very similar here in Israel, this emptiness, this hollow out. Can you describe what you see in the children on a daily basis, in their behavior, in their relationship, in their aspiration? Like, can you actually describe to the parents that are going to listen the emptiness that you see, how it really looks like on a day-to-day behavior?
Yeah. So it's interesting because there's really kind of two kind of relationships that a teacher has with students, right? You have the relationship you have with them as you're up there teaching and you look out and you see them. And in that instance, I would say that a lot of the students are wonderful, right? Again, I have great students, and it's really important for me to emphasize that I'm not just talking about the 150 students I have, right? And that's a lot of my students, come from really great families, and they're very intelligent and very kind, and and all of that. But really what you see that's different is when you talk to them, right? When you get to know them and they stay after class and they chat with you, or they see you after class or before class. And it's in those conversations where you really do kind of hear a lot about how difficult their lives can be. And the word that you hear a lot is anxiety. That word, that our kids are so anxious all the time. And I think that's because a lot of our young people come from a background where they're not exactly sure what their life outside of the classroom is going to look like. A lot of the kids sometimes don't know where their meals are going to come from. A lot of them come from homes where they're not clear if there's any money to go to college, where nobody asks about their grades. I mean, the analogy, Harry, I like to give is kind of like boxing, where when you're watching a boxing match, you go in there and you box hard for 3 minutes. And then what happens after the boxing round? You go to your corner. Well, who's in the corner for you? Your trainer, your coach, your support, and they give you water. They clean you up. They give you advice. They help you, right? Why? Because they know you got to go back into the ring, right? Well, a lot of our kids, they don't go into the ring. They go to school every day. And let me tell you, school is hard, right? To other teenagers, the social anxieties, the academic expectations, kids are mean to one another. School is hard. I mean, everybody who ever went to high school will tell you school is hard. But when we were growing up, we would go home, and guess what? All of our school problems were school. They're left at school, right? They didn't follow us. If a teacher was mean to us, if a kid was being rude to us, whatever, it was at school. We didn't have to worry about it for another 18 hours, right? It was a school problem.
Mhm.
And when we went home, we had our mom, we had our dad, we had our families, and they supported us, and we could talk to them, and we had this network of voices that helped us. I want you to imagine what it's like when you go home every day and all of your problems follow you because you're being hounded on your phone. People are saying things through a text or on social media, or people are making connections or making posts that target you or bother you or upset you. And by the way, there's nobody at home. Right? I mean, there is no family dinner. Nobody. The only food you're going to eat is the food that you make for yourself, and then you go back to your room by yourself and stare at your phone for another 7 hours. Right? I mean, and then the next day, what do you expect to do? You're expected to go back into the classroom. Well, no wonder you're anxious. No wonder you're upset. No wonder you have anxiety. That's going to happen to any of us. And so that's, really it's the individual conversations I see. Really, it's the research that I see. And sometimes, there is this very, very I think this has gotten better in the last year or two, but really kind of after kind of George Floyd in 2020, 2021, you had the 1619 Project. It became very trendy to just kind of dump on your country, to really talk about how awful the United States is, to really focus on all the negativity. And again, I have no problem. In fact, I think it's very important that we acknowledge our failures, and that we have to talk about how we've not lived up to our ideals, to the 14th Amendment, to the Declaration of Independence, to the Gettysburg Address, to Martin Luther King's dream. I mean, there's a million examples of how we haven't done it, and I think we should talk about it. But that's part of a grander story that is incredible about what this country was founded on, the progress we've made, and how incredibly lucky. I mean, we are literally, if you are an American today, you could argue that you're the luckiest human being in human history. If you want to be right, if you want to be free, if you don't want to die in a war, if you don't want to die of disease, if you don't want to be living in poverty, if you want to get an education, if you want to have economic opportunity, if you want to have a vote, I mean, we're better than here. And all the achievements of our civilization, all the incredible things that have happened didn't happen on accident, right? People whose names we do not know and who are long dead sacrificed for us today. And instead of understanding that story, we focus on the negative and say, well, that's the real America. And that's a lot of the things that I've seen where kids don't want to sing the national anthem. A lot of them didn't want to, they don't want to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And that's, it's really in kind of those situations that you see what's going on.
I see. What's happening with relationship, especially the teenagers, and they are becoming adults? Do you see a change in the way they interact with each other, the male and woman? Can you speak about it a little?
Yeah, simple. There's not a lot of dating going on. People don't date the way that they used to. When people go to dances, they go to formal or prom. A lot of them go with their friends. They don't ask somebody out. And so, and of course, dating is really important. Dating has a function when you're younger. You kind of learn what it's like to be in a relationship with another human being. You kind of learn about what you want in another person. What will you settle for? What is a priority? What do you not compromise on? But you also learn about yourself. I mean, let me tell you something. Anybody who's listening to this who's married, there is no better mirror into your own frailties, your own quirks, your own negative characteristics than a marriage. And you kind of learn when you date, I've made a mistake here, or I was selfish here, or I didn't do this and I should have. And you learn how to be with other people. And so I think young people, a lot of them just don't know how to talk to one another. And that's why a lot of people don't date is, that idea of kind of being vulnerable. A lot of them don't know how to do that. When I was talking to some of them a few years ago, like, why don't you guys go to football games anymore? And you know what they said? They said, well, because we might see other people there that we don't want to talk to, and it would be too awkward to have to talk to them, right? So to be vulnerable, to have a conversation, to learn, I mean, flirting is a skill, kind of letting somebody know that maybe you're interested in them. Young people don't know how to do that. And then, Harry, this is the really worrisome thing. And people in their 20s really are not dating, really do not want to have kids. And I think we all know why that is. This is not a theory of mine. This is true, which is it used to be that people's identity was about, things like their family and their faith, right? I am a member of this community. I am a member of this family. I believe in this religion. And those identities have vanished. People aren't members of church. They're not, I'm not Catholic or Baptist or whatever anymore. And a lot of young people nowadays, their most important identity is their political identity. I am a progressive. I am a MAGA Republican. I am whatever. And the problem is, and a lot of people were talking about this, is that young men are becoming more conservative. Young women are becoming more liberal. And at the same time, political identity has replaced religious identity as the most important thing in your life. So if men and women are thinking differently about a subject that has become the most important thing to them, guess what? There's not going to be a lot of dating going on. It used to be religion. I mean, somebody who's kind of conservative evangelical was not going to date somebody who is, an atheist or something. That used to be the line in the sand. Now it's politics. So the next decade is going to be really interesting.
It's basically what you're describing is a vicious loop, because if the culture broke down, family broke down, there is no community, no network of anything, those children are broken, are hurt,
Yeah.
coming to school, learning everything that they shouldn't. Eventually they become isolated, and they feel despair and all of that. Eventually those people in turn are becoming the next generation of people who should create families, but they don't. So eventually the situation will just get worse.
Yeah, well, and it's again, to me, there's a difference between kind of a healthy skepticism where you say, well, I'm gonna question that, I'm gonna ask about that. But what we have in a lot of young people today is a kind of corrosive cynicism, and they're cynical about the country. They're very cynical about the economy. They're very cynical about the planet. A lot of I have young people who say, I don't want to have kids because I don't know what the planet's going to look like. I can never afford a home. People who believe that the country is so thoroughly rotten and all the institutions aren't worth saving. And so, when you kind of see all of that negativity, what happens, of course, is that you really don't want to, devote yourself to perpetuating a system that you don't like. And this is where, and I think a lot of that is just really the sin of kind of what we call presentism, believing that our moment is unique and that it's never been done before. And I would say, yeah, our moment is unique because it's uniquely good. Again, I mean, this is kind of the way I like to look at it, Harry, is, if you didn't know, and this is not my idea. I mean, other people have talked about this, but if you didn't know if you were going to be white or black, rich or poor, gay or straight, whatever, you didn't know anything about where you're going to be born in society. Two questions. When in human history would you want to be born? And two, where? And the answer is you'd want to
Today
be
in the
born
US.
today or at least in a Western country, right? A Western liberal country. You'd want to be born in Canada or England or Israel or Finland or something, right? And yet kids don't believe that. I mean, they really are these masters of doom. And it's just so sad to me because let me tell you something. Life is good and freedom is rare and prosperity is fleeting. And yet we are the beneficiaries of this. We are living. The perch of our existence is not the norm. It's the outpost of human history. And not to take advantage of it is a tragedy. And that's really why I feel so passionately about the things I write about the things I speak about, and why I am an unapologetic romantic about my country and about the classroom. I believe you don't have to go to Disneyland to see magic. You can see it in the classroom when young people believe in themselves and they believe in the possibilities and the enchantment of individual freedom, and they reach high and they dream big, and they understand that they have one shot, one opportunity to use their freedom to build a meaningful life. And by God, I think education, you asked an hour ago, what is education about? It is about exposing young people to ideas and events and possibilities where they might look and say, I want to use my life to be like that person. I want to do what they do. I want to know what they know. I want to be inspired. I want to reach high. I want to dream big. And I want to use my freedom in the hopes of fulfilling it. And that, my friend, is the pursuit of happiness that we should all be thankful for.
Well said, and the perfect finale. I know that your time is limited, so I have to let you go. Thank you very much from the bottom of my
Thank
heart
you.
for this insightful information, and I will send you a link later. And have a beautiful day, and thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Harry. It was an honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.